The Bush blowback, his boast that he waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and would do it again. It is de facto approval of the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers in Iraq who were killed by foreign fighters that al-Qaeda recruited based on the president's policy of torture and abuse of detainees. So says our guest, the former military interrogator known as Matthew Alexander. This man's nonchalant, prideful boast that he waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed now resonating with the intelligence and military communities. The prediction, it will inspire the torturing of American soldiers yet unborn. The former military interrogator who calls himself Matthew Alexander, what he sees as the decades-long consequences of former President Bush's boast Wednesday that he waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. When Countdown continues. We told you yesterday about former President Bush's confession to torture, a practice that drew untold numbers of foreign fighters into combat against U.S. troops. But now in our third story tonight, it turns out that Mr. Bush's unashamed confession, his boasting about it, and declaration of intent to do it again is going to put more American lives at risk, according to those who know best, the military. Throughout America's history, this nation has faced threats to its very existence. George Washington faced execution if he lost the Revolutionary War. The British soldiers he captured might well have had information about imminent attacks that would have cost American blood, or the war itself. But Washington ordered his troops who captured British soldiers, quote, treat them with humanity and let them have no reason to complain of our copying the brutal example of the British. During the War of 1812, when the threat was so grave the White House itself was burned to the ground, President James Madison forswore torture, even in the face of British torture that he called, quote, this outrage against the laws of honorable war. President Lincoln issued the first formal code of conduct for treatment of prisoners, forbidding torture, in 1863. Even though Confederate forces had come so close to the Capitol at times, it had to be evacuated, and they tried to destroy New York. And then there is President Bush, quote, yeah, we waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I'd do it again to save lives. Retired Brigadier General James P. Cullen of the Army Reserve Judge Advocate General Corps, responding to the Huffington Post, quote, Americans not yet born are going to be prisoners of war, and our enemies are going to be able to point back to President Bush and Vice President Cheney saying that waterboarding is okay. It's just shocking to me how he can be so flip about something that is so serious. Joining us now is an actual successful military interrogator, one of the men who helped find al-Zarqawi, who now goes by the pseudonym Matthew Alexander. He is the author of How to Break a Terrorist, the U.S. interrogators who use brains, not brutality, to take down the deadliest man in Iraq. Great, thanks for your time again tonight, sir.
Great to be here, Keith.
Something you said to the Huffington Post about President Bush's remarks. You saw them as, quote, de facto approval of the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers in Iraq. Obviously, President Bush does not literally approve of those deaths. So what exactly did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that, Keith, was that it wasn't some grand revelation that our enemies, that al-Qaeda, was going to use the fact that we tortured and abused prisoners against us to recruit new fighters. It wasn't a surprise that this would make future detainees less willing to cooperate with us, and that it would have several other ill-adverse effects for the long term. So this falls in the category of what General Billy Mitchell once called criminal negligence. It's when you have information beforehand, knowing what the consequences will be, and you make the decision anyways.
The man who told the military there was going to be a Pearl Harbor someday, and even got the day of the week right, and they threw him out for it, by the way, in case the name doesn't ring familiar to the viewer. How do you know that foreign fighters signed up to kill Americans because of outrage over, Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo? Did they tell you that?
Well, I supervised the interrogations of foreign fighters, and they told our interrogators that day in and day out. But I didn't need to supervise interrogations to know that, because every interrogator who arrived in Iraq at the time into my task force was given a briefing that was based on statistics that we compiled showing that the #1 reason foreign fighters had come there was because of the torture and abuse at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay.
As we mentioned, throughout history, American interrogators, even in World War II, and again, the threat there was a lot more existential than the one al-Qaeda has posed. Interrogators have, in policy and almost always in practice, used brains, as your book suggests, rather than brutality, and succeeded not just in getting intel, but in advancing at the same time a positive image of the United States, even from the people with whom we were at war. What changed?
Well, I think it's best described as a perfect storm of conditions. The first being the failure of leadership to step back away from their emotions. I mean, we all felt those strong emotions after 9/11, the tragedy of that day. but the failure of leaders to step back from those emotions and to do their professional duty, to not let their decisions be ruled by them. It's what General George C. Marshall, the commander of U.S. forces in the European theater during World War II, called the beast within every man that arises. But he said that it was the duty of leaders to keep that beast on its chain in themselves and in their men. In this failure of leadership, in ignoring interrogations experts, we had plenty of experts, men like Colonel Stu Harrington, a legendary expert from Vietnam who knew the ill effects of coercive techniques, but also knew how to do interrogations the right way and had done it successfully in Vietnam and in Panama. And there was a refusal to turn to these experts, and instead they went to amateurs.
So give me an overall impression of what the impact of that event the other night that President Bush held, sitting there in a tuxedo in a plush chair, explaining really with startling nonchalance that, yeah, he waterboarded or had Khalid Sheikh Mohammed waterboarded, and he'd do it again to save lives. Well, if you are somebody in the Middle East contemplating involvement in anti-American activity of any kind, what changed for you? Is there a way to measure that?
Well, Keith, this is exactly what I've been saying in terms of we can't fight a short-term war. Everything we do, whether it's drone strikes, whether it's detention policy, whether it's interrogation policy, has to be coordinated towards one goal, and that's stopping terrorist recruitment. We're never going to end this conflict by stopping terrorist attacks. We can play terrorist whack-a-mole for another 100 years. What we have to do is win the hearts and minds, as we like to say, and stop people from joining extremist groups. And when the former president says that he'd water people again, all this does is give Al-Qaeda another recruitment tool, and we lose that long-term war.
Matthew Alexander, former interrogator for the U.S. military, author of How to Break a Terrorist. Great thanks again for your time, and I hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks to be here, Keith.